In the latest episode of the TV game show The White House on Uber, How to Pre-Purchase an American President, it appeared fleetingly as if the host was reading from the right script. Donald Trump said in Saudi Arabia that liberal interventionism was a disaster. True. He said you can't make or break nations. Post-Soviet Russia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya and Yemen are each testimony to that. He stopped bombing Yemen and reversed decades of sanctions on Syria, blocking in the process two of Israel's main routes to regional dominance, a divided Syria and a weakened Iran. I say fleetingly because what a US president promises and what he delivers are actually two different things. Iran knows all about that when it thought sanctions were going to be lifted in exchange for curtailing its nuclear enrichment program. Not least of those to be blindsided by Trump's announcement halting Syria sanctions were his own officials in the US Treasury. Unpicking the piles of sanctions that have been layered on Syria since it was first put on a list of countries which sponsor terrorism will not be rapid or comprehensive. However, this particular episode of the show cost its sponsors, Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Qatar, more than $3 trillion and counting, which is high even by the lavish standards of the Gulf. There was $6 billion from Saudi Arabia, $1.2 trillion worth of deals with Qatar, a personal 747 for use as president, a tower for Trump's son Eric, and an AI center in Dubai, and much more to come, including cryptocurrency deals with the Trump family firm World Liberty Financial. The richest Arabs were competing with each other to lay tribute at the feet of Washington's latest emperor. While this orgiastic display of wealth was taking place in Riyadh and Doha, Israel was marking the anniversary of the 1948 Nakba by killing as many Palestinians as it could in Gaza and the West Bank. Nearly 100 people were killed on the day in which Trump was in Riyadh. Bunker-busting bombs were dropped near the European hospital at Khan Yunis, a strike aimed at Mohammed Sinwar, the de facto leader of Hamas in Gaza. Like the assassination of the late Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, Israel was targeting a key negotiator at a time when it was purporting to negotiate. If indeed Sinwar is dead, it will take time to re-establish secure communication within Hamas, with one of several men who could now step into his shoes. His attempted or actual killing is proof, if any more is needed, that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had no intention of bringing the remaining hostages home alive. A hostage deal needs Hamas's forces to retain command and control. A guerrilla fight needs none. Netanyahu's mission in Gaza, which is to starve and bomb as many of the 2.1 million Palestinians out of the enclave as he can, as the famine caused by a 2-month total blockade of food, water and electricity has deepened. Not even the international community can ignore it. Not a day passes without a call from the UN that genocide is indeed taking place, and some European leaders have reacted. French President Emmanuel Macron called the Israeli policy in Gaza shameful. The Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez called Israel a genocidal state while speaking in Parliament and noting that Madrid does not do business with such a country. But not one public word of condemnation about Israel's behaviour in Gaza was spoken to Trump from the lips of Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince and de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, nor from the UAE President Mohammed bin Zayed, or the Qatari Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani. The charade in the Gulf was a massive betrayal for Palestinians, but as Palestinians know only too well, Arab rulers have a track record of abandoning them. Hamas and Hezbollah have both been severely weakened, although I question whether the blows they have received are terminal. But Hamas is still fighting on the ground as the underreported Israeli military death toll in Gaza continues to show, and no single guard has given up their hostage to save their own lives. The spirit of resistance in Gaza has not been defeated. In fact, the parallels with another historic defeat of colonial forces, the French and the Americans, have only grown stronger. In one sense, there is no comparison between Gaza and the Vietnam War. The force Israel uses today in Gaza dwarfs that used by John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson and Richard Nixon, the 3 US presidents whose terms were stained by Vietnam. In a span of 8 years, the US dropped more than 5 million tons of bombs on Vietnam, making it the most bombed place on earth. But by January of this year, Israel had dropped at least 100,000 tons of bombs on Gaza. Put another way, the US dropped around 15 tons of explosive per square kilometre of Vietnam, while Israel has dropped 275 tons per square kilometre of Gaza, a figure that is higher by a factor of 18. That being said, the current generation of war watchers can only experience a crushing sense of déjà vu when they watch the painstakingly complete account of the conflict in a new mini-series, Turning Point, the Vietnam War. The since acknowledged futility of the US military campaign against the Viet Cong is mirrored and amplified by Israel's military attempts to wipe Hamas off the face of the map. As the US involvement in the Vietnam War expanded, and Washington had to drop the pretense that more than 16,000 troops and pilots were advising the South Vietnamese army, it became clear to both Washington and Saigon that they were going to have to push the Viet Cong out of the countryside and regain government control of around 12,000 hamlets. Probably nothing turned the Vietnamese villagers in South Vietnam against the US and their own government in Saigon faster than something called the Strategic Hamlet Program. These were the fortified settlements where villagers who had been turned out of their ancestral lands by the US troops could be forced to resettle. In the jargon of the newsreel at the time, the villagers could start a new life purged of the communists. Closely allied to this was another assumption of the US pacification program, the father of today's counterinsurgency. This was born out of the problems US soldiers had in distinguishing civilians from combatants. The solution lay in treating any Vietnamese encountered in a declared fire-free zone as the enemy and opening fire without referring up the chain of command. The US troops were told that as all Vietnamese were free to leave, it followed as night follows day that all the Vietnamese that stayed were part of the infrastructure of the Viet Cong. The villagers starved in their Viet Cong-free encampments because they lost access to their paddy fields. The main aim, however, was not to feed them, but to clear the countryside. The result was that the villagers fled their encampments and the Viet Cong came ever closer to the cities. Now, there are two other similarities between today and 1968. The protests and the vicious levels of repression on US campuses, and the extent to which the American and Israeli militaries felt they had to dehumanize their enemy before committing atrocities. After the 1968 My Lai massacre, in which around 500 unarmed and innocent civilians were killed in the span of just a few hours, the American commander, General William Westmoreland, said that life is cheap to the Vietnamese. He said, "The Oriental doesn't put the same high price on life as the Westerner." Israeli leaders go much further than Westmoreland did. They called Palestinians human animals. Indeed, all this history from decades ago sounds eerily pertinent to the present day in Gaza and the occupied West Bank. From the general's plan to starve over 1 million Palestinians out of North Gaza to today's current military operation called Gideon's Chariots, the tactic of terrorizing and starving the Palestinians into the boats and the sea is the same. Israel's admission that it will let in a bare minimum of food simply seals the legal case against it in the International Court of Justice. What Vietnam did for LBJ and Nixon, Gaza will do for Netanyahu and his successor as Prime Minister, probably Naftali Bennett. For Netanyahu is much more ill from cancer than he is publicly acknowledged to be, according to sources in Britain who see him regularly. Two factors ended the Vietnam War, and with it more than a century of struggle to rid a country of a colonial master: the determination of the Vietnamese and public opinion in America. The same two factors will lead the Palestinian people to their own state: the determination of Palestinians to stay or die on their land, and public opinion in the West, which is already rapidly turning against Israel. Watch it carefully. It is seeping into even right-wing circles and is firmly established on the left. Labelling legitimate criticism of the genocide that is taking place as anti-Semitic won't work anymore. That bolt has already been fired. It is both in Palestine and in the hearts and minds of the West from which the Zionist project grew and flourished, and on which it is so dependent that this war is being fought. Israel may win each battle, as the Americans did in Vietnam, but it will lose the war.